Adelaide Vance was 68 years old when she finally understood what her husband's family had never bothered to hide. 30 years of holidays, 30 years of birthdays, 30 years of standing just outside the frame while a photographer arranged everyone else in a place. Not once in 3 decades had anyone handed her a copy of the Vance family portrait. She told herself it didn't matter. Then Julian died, and a stranger in a gray suit read a document that changed everything she thought she knew about her own marriage. If you've ever been treated like a guest in your own home, if you've ever felt the particular sting of being tolerated instead of loved, if you've ever wondered whether the people who ignored you would live to regret it, stay with this one all the way to the end. Because what Adelaide found in a locked cedar chest, and what her name was already doing on a deed she'd never seen, will tell you something about patience that a courtroom couldn't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Adelaide Winslow had been 38 when she met Julian Vance at a maritime trade dinner in New Haven. She was there representing a small shipping insurance firm, the only woman at a table of underwriters who kept forgetting her name. Julian noticed. He was 51 then, recently widowed, running a logistics company his own father had built from 3 barges into a fleet. He asked her opinion on cargo liability rates, and then he asked her to dinner the following week, and Adelaide, who had spent most of her adult life being professionally competent and personally invisible, said yes before she'd fully decided to. They married 11 months later in a small ceremony neither of his children attended by choice. Preston was 26 at the time, already running a division of his father's company, and already resentful that his father needed anything from anyone, least of all a second wife. Corinne was 23, recently engaged to a man from an old Fairfield County family, and she made her feelings about Adelaide plain within the first 10 minutes of meeting her. "My mother has only been gone 2 years, she said, not quite looking at Adelaide, looking instead at a spot just past her shoulder. Theo was 19, away at college, and mostly just absent, which Adelaide would come to learn was its own kind of message. For the first several years, Adelaide tried the way people try when they still believe effort gets rewarded eventually. She learned Preston's coffee order and had it ready when he visited. She remembered Corinne's wedding anniversary before Corinne's own assistant did. She wrote Theo letters at school, actual letters, because Julian mentioned once that Theo's mother used to write him letters, and Adelaide thought, foolishly perhaps, that continuing a small tradition might count for something. It didn't count for much. What Adelaide got back mostly was politeness, the kind of politeness that has a closed door behind it. She managed Ashcombe Manor, the Vance family estate in Connecticut, a white colonial with black shutters and 11 acres that Julian's father had bought in 1961. She ran the household staff, planned the holidays, hosted the anniversary parties and the christenings and the 4th of July gatherings that brought 40 people onto that lawn every summer. She did it well. Guests complimented the food, the flowers, the way the whole event seemed to run itself. Julian would thank her privately, later, in the quiet of their bedroom, in a voice that never quite matched the confidence he showed at the head of the table. And every single year, when the photographer arranged the family for the formal portrait that hung in the front hallway, someone found a reason for Adelaide to be elsewhere. Once it was genuinely an accident, the photographer running late while she checked on the caterers. After that first year, though, the timing became something she noticed and then something she expected. Corinne would suggest the photo happen while the lights still good. Conveniently, during the 15 minutes Adelaide was refilling the punch bowl, Preston would wave her off with, "You don't need to be in this one. It's just as kids with Dad for old time's sake." 30 portraits went up on that hallway wall over 30 years. Julian, Preston, Corinne, Theo, and later their spouses and children as the family grew. Adelaide was in none of them. She used to walk past that wall on her way to bed and count the gap where she should have been standing, and eventually she stopped counting because counting made it worse. Julian never seemed to notice the wall, or if he noticed, he never said anything, and Adelaide learned not to bring it up, the same way she learned not to ask too many questions about the property he owned 2 hours west, The one he visited alone 4 or 5 times a year, always for a night or two, always vague about the reason. Just checking on an old building, he'd say, "Nothing that concerns you, dear." She believed him, because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because 30 years of marriage teaches you which questions are worth the fight and which ones aren't. She had no idea, not for a single one of those years, that the building he was checking on had her name attached to it in a filing cabinet at the county clerk's office. She had no idea that a deed existed with her signature on it, a signature she did not remember signing, dated to a spring afternoon in the first year of their marriage. She had no idea that the wall of portraits she wasn't in was, in its own way, the least important wall in the family's history. She would learn all of it. But first, she had to survive the death of the man who'd kept it from her, and the 30 days that came after. Julian Vance died on a Thursday in October in the study at Ashcombe Manor, at his desk, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Adelaide found him there at 6 in the evening when she came to tell him dinner was ready. The doctor said his heart simply stopped, quickly, probably painlessly, the kind of death people call merciful when they're trying to comfort the person left behind. Adelaide sat in the study for almost an hour before she called anyone. Not a shock exactly. Out of some instinct to have one last quiet moment with him before the house, filled with people who would need things from her. The house filled with people within 2 days. Preston arrived first, with his wife and a lawyer he introduced only as a family friend, which Adelaide understood immediately meant something else. Corinne arrived the next morning with a florist already booked and a guest list already drafted, moving through the house like she'd been waiting for this specific errand her whole adult life. Theo came last, quiet as always, and hugged Adelaide for slightly longer than either of his siblings had, which she noticed and tried not to read too much into. The funeral was held at Trinity Episcopal in Greenwich, the church where the Vance family had been baptized and married and buried for 3 generations. It was full. Julian had built one of the largest independent logistics companies on the eastern seaboard, and half the people in those pews were men in dark suits who'd done business with him and wanted to be seen having done business with him. Preston delivered the eulogy. He spoke about his father's business acumen, his instincts, his relentless standards. He spoke for 9 minutes and did not mention Adelaide once. She sat in the second pew, not the front. Preston had explained, gently, the way people explain things they've already decided, that the front pew should be immediate family only, and then gestured her toward the second row like she was being shown to a table or restaurant. She sat there in a black dress that Julian had once told her he loved, and she listened to strangers describe a man she'd shared a bed with for 3 decades, and none of their descriptions sounded like someone she'd know. At the reception afterward, held at Corinne's home in Darien, Adelaide overheard 2 of Corinne's friends near the dessert table. She held up better than I expected. One of them murmured, Considering what, exactly, the other said. She was married to him 30 years. What's she supposed to do? Fall apart in public? That's not really her style, is it? Adelaide moved on before she heard the rest, though she didn't need to. She understood the tone. She had understood it for 30 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 6 days after the funeral, at the offices of Pryor and Hastings in downtown Stamford. Nathaniel Pryor had been Julian's attorney for close to 20 years, a careful, soft-spoken man who'd attended enough Vance family gatherings to know exactly how the dynamics worked, and who greeted Adelaide that morning with a warmth that felt, in hindsight, like he already knew what was coming and didn't entirely agree with it. Adelaide dressed carefully. She told herself there was no reason for her hands to be shaking on the drive down, that 30 years of marriage entitled her to some basic assumption of security, that whatever complicated feelings Julian's children carried toward her, Julian himself had chosen her, had built a life with her, had thanked her in that quiet bedroom, voice more nights than she could count. Surely that counted for something on paper, even if it had never counted for much on a hallway wall. Preston, Corinne, and Theo arrived together, each with their own attorney trailing a half step behind, the 3 of them arranging themselves on one side of the conference table like a small, well-dressed army. Adelaide sat alone on the other side, a folder in her lap that she hadn't opened, her wedding ring turning slowly under her thumb. Nathaniel Pryor cleared his throat, opened the folder in front of him, and began reading in the flat, careful voice that lawyers use when they already suspect the room is about to break. The estate of Julian Adelaide Vance, he said, is valued, as of this filing, at approximately $11 million. Adelaide felt her shoulders loosen just slightly. $11 million. Whatever this document said, surely there was room in that number for the woman who had run his household for 30 years, who had hosted his clients, raised his glasses, buried his silences. Surely Julian had made room for her. She did not yet know how carefully that room had been built or how far away from that conference table it actually was. Nathaniel Pryor continued reading, his voice even, professional, giving nothing away. The primary residence, Ashcombe Manor, along with the surrounding 11 acres, is left in its entirety to Preston Vance, Corinne Vance Whitfield, and Theo Vance, to be divided equally or sold with proceeds split 3 ways, as the 3 of them determine appropriate. Preston's jaw tightened in something close to satisfaction. Corinne was already looking at her phone, though whether she was reading something or simply avoiding eye contact, Adelaide couldn't tell. The operating interest in Vance Logistics Group, valued at approximately $6.2 million, is left in its entirety to the 3 Vance children, structured as equal shareholding positions, effective immediately upon probate. Adelaide sat very still. She had known, in some vague and unexamined way, that the company would go to Julian's children. That had never been the question in her mind. The question, the one she hadn't let herself ask out loud until this exact moment, was what would be left over for her. She had spent 30 years assuming there would be something. Not out of greed, out of a basic, almost naive faith that a marriage counted for something when the paperwork got written. The remaining investment and retirement accounts, Nathaniel continued, totaling approximately $3.8 million, are to be divided equally among Preston, Corinne, and Theo. The room had gone very quiet. Adelaide realized she was gripping the edge of the folder in her lap hard enough to bend the corner. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "What was left for me?" Nathaniel Pryor looked at her the way a man looks at someone he genuinely likes and cannot help. He glanced down at the document, and something in his face suggested he'd fought this exact language once, in some private meeting Adelaide had never been part of, and lost. "I have to read this next section verbatim," he said. Those were his instructions. He took a slow breath. "My wife, Adelaide Winslow Vance, has enjoyed a comfortable and secure life for 30 years as a direct result of my success and my family standing. She has wanted for nothing, and her role in managing our household has been, I believe, more than fairly compensated by that comfort. I do not consider it necessary or appropriate to divide my life's work, built for my children and their children, in order to further provide for her." Every word landed exactly the way it was written to land. 30 years, reduced to room and board. Adelaide felt something in her chest go cold, and then colder, a sensation she would later describe, when she finally had someone to describe it to, as the specific feeling of being erased by a person who was no longer alive to explain himself. Preston was not bothering to hide his relief. Corinne had set her phone down and was studying her own hands with the kind of composed indifference she'd perfected over 30 years of family gatherings. Theo, at least, was looking at the table, not at Adelaide, which she registered as its own small kindness, the only one in the room. "The will does specify one additional item," Nathaniel said, and here his voice changed slightly, gained a careful precision that made Adelaide look up. "A property located at 12 Cinder Hollow Road, in the town of Thistlewood Hollow, along with all contents contained within, is left to Adelaide Winslow Vance, along with a sealed cedar chest currently held in my personal safe deposit box, to be delivered to her directly upon the reading of this document." Corinne broke the silence that followed with a short, almost pitying laugh. "Dad mentioned that place years ago," she said. "Some old stone houses Uncle left him. He always said it wasn't worth the property taxes. She looked at Adelaide with an expression arranging itself into sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. Well, at least it's something. A roof over your head. Preston stood, already moving into logistics. We'll want to get Ashcombe listed within the quarter. The market's strong right now for estates like this. He glanced at Adelaide, almost as an afterthought. You'll have 30 days to arrange things, obviously. We're not going to rush you out. 30 days is not a courtesy, Preston, Nathaniel said, a hint of steel entering his voice for the first time all morning. It's what the will requires. Adelaide is entitled to every one of those days. Of course, Preston said, in the smooth tone of a man already 3 steps ahead. Take your 30 days, Adelaide. Nobody's rushing you. Nathaniel slid a small key and a folded document across the table, along with a slip of paper. On it, in Julian's familiar, deliberate handwriting, were 4 lines. Adelaide, go to Cinder Hollow as soon as you're able. Everything will make sense once you arrive. Forgive me for the 30 years I couldn't explain. All my love, always Julian. Adelaide read it twice, then a 3rd time, and felt something twist in her that was equal parts grief and fury. Forgive him. After a document that had just reduced her to a well-compensated house guest in front of his children, he was asking her to trust him one more time. She stood without a word to any of them and walked out of that conference room on legs that did not feel entirely her own, the folded deed pressed against her chest like something she needed to protect. The 30 days that followed were, in their way, a masterclass in how cruelty gets dressed up as practicality. Preston, Corinne, and their spouses started coming to Ashcombe Manor within the first week, bringing contractors and real estate agents, walking through rooms with tape measures while Adelaide was still sleeping down the hall. Nobody asked her to leave her room. They simply behaved as though she already had, as though the woman standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea was some kind of holdover detail the new owners hadn't gotten around to addressing yet. She was in the sunroom one morning, reading, when Corinne came through with a real estate agent and a swatch book of paint colors. We'll want to open this whole space up, Corinne was saying, gesturing at the built-in shelving that had held 30 years of Adelaide's gardening books and family photos, most of them photos she'd taken herself, since she was rarely in anyone else's. Buyers want light. Buyers want flow. This feels closed in. The agent nodded, made a note, and neither of them so much as glanced toward the chair where Adelaide sat with her book open on her lap, unread. Another afternoon, Preston walked the grounds with a landscaping crew, discussing the rose beds Adelaide had planted the second spring of her marriage, when she'd still believed that tending something with her hands might make this house feel like it belonged to her too. All this needs to come out, he told the foreman, not lowering his voice at all, though Adelaide was 30 feet away, deadheading the same roses he was describing as clutter. Clean lines, something low maintenance for whoever buys it. At night, alone in the bedroom she'd shared with Julian for 3 decades, the fear arrived in waves that felt almost physical. She was 68. She hadn't held a paying job since she left the insurance firm the year she married Julian. Her resume, if she still had reason to write one, would have a 30-year gap in it that no employer would know what to do with. The Cinder Hollow property was, by every account she'd heard from the family, an old stone building not worth the taxes on it. Maybe she could sell it for something modest. Maybe that would carry her a few years if she was careful. And then what? She would lie there doing the arithmetic of her own decline until her chest went tight and she had to sit up in the dark just to breathe properly. Some nights the fear gave way to something sharper. How had she spent 30 years building a life around a man who let his own children speak about her tending like she was disposable garden clutter? How had she never once demanded better? But anger, she was learning, takes energy she didn't have to spare, not on top of grief and terror in equal measure. So mostly she just kept packing. She packed her clothes into 3 suitcases and gave away most of what she owned, because none of it had ever really felt like hers anyway, chosen more for what Julian's world expected than for what she wanted. She kept 2 boxes of things that were unmistakably her own, photographs from before the marriage, letters from her mother, a few books that had been her grandmother's. 30 years, and this was what remained portable. On the 26th day, she was in the kitchen when she heard Preston and Corinne talking in the dining room, either forgetting she could hear them or simply not caring. "I honestly can't believe Dad left her anything at all," Corinne was saying. "That Cinder Hollow place is probably worth $40,000, if that." "Guilt," Preston said. 30 years is a long time to keep someone around without really including her. This was his version of squaring it with himself. "I'd guess, without actually touching what matters. She should be grateful, honestly. A woman her age with no work history, no family of her own. Most women in her position end up in assisted living paid for by strangers. At least she'll have a little something." They laughed, quietly, the specific laugh of people who have never once had to calculate how many years $40,000 might buy them. Adelaide stood at the sink with both hands pressed flat against the counter and said nothing, because 30 years of practice had taught her exactly how to swallow a reaction before it reached her mouth. On her last morning at Ashcombe, she walked through the house once, room by room, waiting to feel something like grief and finding, mostly, that she didn't. The rooms had never really been hers. Only the garden had, and she stood among the roses Preston wanted torn out and let herself cry there, quietly, for the only thing in that house that had ever actually belonged to her. She loaded her car at 1 in the afternoon. Preston arrived to supervise, unable to resist confirming with his own eyes that she was actually leaving on schedule. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment before she got into the car. "Do you have any idea what it is," she said, "to give someone 30 years and be told it bought you a roof and nothing more?" Preston didn't answer. Adelaide didn't wait for one. She pulled out of the long gravel drive and pointed her car west, toward Thistlewood Hollow, toward a stone building nobody in the family thought was worth the drive to see. Thistlewood Hollow turned out to be smaller than Adelaide expected, and somehow less forgotten than Corinne's offhand description had suggested. Main Street held maybe a dozen buildings around a modest square. A feed store with a hand-lettered sign, a diner with a hand-painted window, a post office the size of a garden shed, a stone church with a squat steeple, and a library that looked older than the country itself. As she drove through, following her GPS at a crawl, she noticed people pausing to watch her car, not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition, as if they'd been told to expect her. A man sweeping the steps outside the feed store lifted a hand in an easy wave. A woman arranging flower buckets outside the diner turned and watched her pass, nodding slightly to herself, like she was checking something off a list only she could see. The GPS directed her off Main Street on a Cinder Hollow road, which held its pavement for perhaps a quarter mile before surrendering to packed dirt and disappearing into forest. Old oaks lined both sides, thick-trunked, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy that turned the afternoon light into something dappled and slow. The road was rutted enough that Adelaide had to ease her sedan along at walking pace, wincing every time the undercarriage scraped. After what felt like much longer than the mile it probably was, the GPS announced her arrival in its flat mechanical voice, and Adelaide stopped the car and simply sat there for a moment, afraid to look up, afraid of finding exactly what Corinne had promised her she'd find. Then she raised her eyes, and the house was nothing like that at all. It sat in a wide, clearing ring by those same massive oaks, built of gray fieldstone that had clearly stood since some time in the previous century, maybe earlier. 2 stories, a steep slate roof still holding its lines, leaded windows under white trim, a heavy oak door beneath a small stone portico. Ivy climbed one wall in a way that looked tended rather than neglected. The gardens around it had gone wild, but Adelaide could see the old bones of the design underneath. Stone paths half swallowed by grass, a dry fountain standing at the center of what had once been a formal bed, roses grown loose and enormous from decades without pruning. She heard footsteps on the dirt road behind her before she'd finished taking it in. A woman was walking toward the car with the brisk pace of someone who'd been expecting this exact moment for longer than she'd admit. She wore a flannel work shirt and carried a basket covered with a dish towel. "You're Adelaide," the woman said. "Not a question." "I am. How did you know?" "We've been waiting on you a good while now." The woman held out the basket. "Ruth and Delacroix. I run the feed store and the co-op counter in town." Brought you bread, eggs, some coffee. Figured the pantry here wouldn't have much fresh in it. Adelaide took the basket automatically, still trying to catch up to what was happening. Julian never once mentioned this place to me. 30 years, and he never said a word. Ruth Ann's face softened into something that looked like sympathy layered over old, settled knowledge. He came out here regular, dear. Once a month, sometimes twice. Kept this place up himself, mostly. Told us plainly that when he passed, his wife would end up standing right where you're standing, and that we shouldn't be surprised when it happened. She started toward the house, gesturing for Adelaide to follow. He said you wouldn't know beforehand. So it had to be that way. For your own protection. Protection from what? From them, I guess, Ruth said, not unkindly. The children from his first wife. He never said much detail, but he made it clear they'd never accepted you, and that if they got wind of this place while he was still living, they'd find some legal way to take it before you ever got the chance. She led Adelaide up the stone path, produced a small key that fit smoothly despite its age, and the oak door swung open with barely a sound. "Welcome to Fernwood Hall," Ruth said, stepping aside to let Adelaide enter first. That's what he called it. Said it was the one place he ever got to just be a person instead of Julian Vance, president and CEO. Adelaide crossed the threshold, and the ground beneath her understanding of her own life shifted, quietly and completely. The interior was not falling apart. It was beautiful. Wide plank floors worn smooth with decades of care. A stone fireplace anchoring one wall, its mantel a single slab of oak. The furniture was simple, worn the way good furniture wears, leather gone soft with use, chairs angled to catch the afternoon light through the leaded glass. Bookshelves lined one wall, and every surface not holding a book held a framed photograph. Photographs of Adelaide. Adelaide on her wedding day, younger, laughing at something out of frame. Adelaide, kneeling in a garden with dirt on her hands. Adelaide asleep in a porch chair, unaware of the camera. Dozens of them, spanning what looked like every decade of her marriage, arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for something people worship. He loved you something fierce, Ruth said quietly. Anybody who ever stood in this room could see that plain as day. Adelaide's eyes filled for the first time since Julian had died. She had been too stunned at the funeral, too frozen through the will reading, too frightened through 30 days of being slowly erased. Standing here, surrounded by evidence she hadn't known existed, she finally let herself break. Ruth let her cry for a while, then guided her gently to the sofa and gave her a few minutes before speaking again. "There's more to see," she said. "Then I'll leave you be for the day. But you ought to see the rest first." She led Adelaide through a kitchen that mixed old and new without apology. A farmhouse sink beside a modern range. Copper pots hanging from an iron rack. Open shelves holding dishware Adelaide had never laid eyes on. A dining room held a long oak table clearly built for more people than had ever likely sat there. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, simply furnished, and in the largest one, more photographs still dozens Adelaide had never known were taken, candid shots of her doing nothing remarkable at all, hanging laundry, laughing at some joke lost to memory, reading with her feet tucked under her. "The house has stayed up through a fund your husband set aside years back," Ruth explained as they came back down. "Bank handles the utilities, the taxes, upkeep, and repairs. Set to run 50 years out. You won't need to think twice about the cost of keeping this place standing." "Why hide it?" Adelaide asked, her voice thinner than she intended. 30 years, Ruth Ann. Why not just tell me it existed?" "Because of them," Ruth Ann said simply, and led her to a door beneath the staircase Adelaide hadn't noticed on the way in. Behind it was a small, windowless study, shelves built floor to ceiling on 3 walls, holding not books but folders and document boxes, each labeled in Julian's careful hand. A mahogany desk sat against the 4th wall, a banker's lamp with a green shade, a leather chair worn into the shape of someone who'd sat there often. On the desk, centered with obvious intent, sat a cream envelope with my Adelaide written across the front. "This is what he really built this place to hold," Ruth said softly, and stepped out to give her privacy. Adelaide's hands shook badly enough that she nearly tore the envelope opening it. Inside were 6 pages in Julian's handwriting, and just seeing it made her chest tighten all over again. "My Adelaide," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found your way to Fernwood. I am more sorry than I know how to write that it had to happen this way, that I couldn't share this place with you while I still couldn't explain any of it while you might have asked me questions I wasn't brave enough to answer honestly. Preston, Corinne, and Theo have spent 30 years watching for any excuse to challenge decisions they didn't like. If they'd known this place existed while I was alive, their lawyers would have found some argument for calling it marital property, community property, anything that let them stake a claim. I know this because I spent 40 years as a businessman learning exactly how people find those arguments. So I hid it. For 30 years, I hid it and protected it and built it, slowly, into something worth protecting. I inherited this house from my Uncle Elias in the spring of the year we married, 3 months after our wedding. He was a quiet man, a historian, and he left it to me with one instruction: protect this place for someone you love more than anything else living. I have spent 30 years trying to earn the right to pass that instruction on to you. I know what the will said. I know exactly how those words must have sounded, sitting across from Nathaniel, hearing yourself described in those terms after 30 years. Please understand, I wrote it that way on purpose because I knew my children would read every line of it looking for a way to take something from you. I gave them precisely what they wanted to see: the house, the company shares, the accounts. What I didn't tell them is that Ashcombe carries a mortgage most of them don't know about, and that the shares come bound to conditions that will make them considerably harder to enjoy than they expect. But you, Adelaide, I gave you the only thing that ever actually mattered. This house sits on 210 acres, most of it protected woodland. A conservation trust valued the land alone at close to $3 million last year, though the decision to sell or keep it belongs entirely to you. The house itself carries its own value as a historic structure. The deed has carried your name since the year we married. It was never mine to leave you because it was already yours. There's more in these files than deeds and figures. 40 years of business teaches a man things about the people around him, some of it unflattering, none of it invented. I never used any of it. That would have made me no better than the worst of them. But I kept it carefully because information is its own kind of insurance, and if my children ever try to take this place from you or make your life difficult in any way, you'll have what you need to make them stop. I failed you in life by being too much of a coward to defend you publicly the way you deserved. I hope, in death, I've managed something braver. This house was built from love, protected by love, and I'm sorrier than these pages can hold that you had to wait this long to see it. Forever yours, Julian. Adelaide read it 3 times through, and each pass pulled something new loose in her chest. When she finally looked up, Ruth Ann stood quietly in the doorway again, patient, unsurprised. He was a complicated man, Ruth Ann said, but there wasn't a complicated thing about how he felt for you. That much he got right. Adelaide spent her first 2 weeks at Fernwood Hall in a kind of suspended disbelief, turning the events of the will reading over and over until they finally made a different kind of sense. Ruth Ann came by nearly every day, gradually introducing her to other residents of Thistlewood Hollow, and each one seemed to carry a story about Julian that had nothing to do with the man his children had eulogized. The pastor at the small stone church told her Julian had quietly paid for the entire roof replacement 4 years earlier and refused any acknowledgement beyond a handshake. An older woman named Mrs. Alders mentioned, almost in passing, that Julian had funded her granddaughter's full 4 years of college as an anonymous scholarship, though the family had eventually pieced together who was behind it. The young man who ran the library told her Julian had shown up one afternoon with a check large enough to save it from a budget cut that would have shut its doors for good. He talked about you every time he came through, Ruth Ann told her one evening, the two of them sitting on the now-swept stone porch with tea going cold between them. Showed me pictures on his phone half the time. Asked if I thought the house was good enough for you yet, whether there was more that needed doing before you got here. Said you were the only person in his whole life who never wanted a single thing from him except him. 2 weeks in, Nathaniel Pryor called. I wanted to give you fair warning, he said. Preston has retained outside counsel. He's planning to challenge the will. On what grounds? Adelaide asked, and was faintly surprised at how level her own voice sounded. He's arguing Fernwood should count as marital property, subject to division, and that Julian deliberately undervalued it to keep more from you and, in his view, from them. He wants a court to force a sale and split the proceeds 4 ways. Adelaide looked around the study at the filing cabinets Julian had spent 30 years filling. Let him try, Nathaniel. The deeds have my name on it since 1994. Long before anything about this marriage could be called into question by a court. I know, Nathaniel said. I helped him file it that way, years ago, though I didn't know why at the time. I just wanted you prepared. Preston's lawyers aren't cheap, and they're not gentle. I've had 30 years of not gentle, Adelaide said. I'll manage this part. 4 days later, a black SUV came up the dirt road, Preston driving, Corinne and Theo in the back seat. Adelaide watched from an upstairs window as all 3 of them stepped out and took in the house. The gardens, the clear and obvious value of everything Corinne had once dismissed as a falling-down building not worth the taxes. Their faces shifted in real time, from certainty into something closer to confusion. She let them knock before she came down. Preston, Corinne, Theo, she said, opening the door with a calm that surprised even her. Would you like to come in? They followed her into the front room, and Adelaide watched them absorb the photographs covering every wall, 3 decades of her own face looking back at them from frames Julian had chosen and hung himself. She served tea in china she'd found in the kitchen cabinets, unhurried, entirely at ease in a house that had somehow already become hers in every way that mattered. We came to talk about the property, Preston finally said, setting his cup down without drinking from it. We think there's been a serious misunderstanding about what Dad actually intended here. What kind of misunderstanding? Adelaide asked, taking a slow sip of her own tea. The value, Corinne said. We've had it assessed independently. This land, this house, it's worth considerably more than anyone realized when a will was drafted. As his children, we believe that anything of this significance acquired during the marriage should be treated as a shared asset. It wasn't acquired during the marriage, Adelaide said. It was deeded to me directly 3 months after our wedding, 30 years ago. I have the documents. Nathaniel has the documents. We don't accept that as final, Theo said quietly, the first time he'd spoken. Not without a court weighing in. Then I suppose you'll need to take me to court, Adelaide said, and stood. She walked to the study and returned with a thick folder, setting on the coffee table between them like something she was choosing not to raise her voice over. Before you decide to do that, you should know what's in here. Your father spent 40 years as a businessman learning things about the people around him, including his own children. He documented all of it. He never used any of it while he was alive, because he was better than that. He left the choice to me. Preston's face had gone pale in a way Adelaide hadn't seen since the day of the funeral. You're bluffing. I've never once bluffed in my life, Preston. Your father taught me that, among other things. She looked at each of them in turn. There are things in here about business dealings, about financial arrangements during certain divorces, about accounting practices that would not survive a closer look. I'm not interested in using any of it. I'm interested in never having this conversation again. She let the silence hold a moment before continuing. So here's my only offer. Walk away. Accept the will exactly as it stands. Live your lives with the company, the house, whatever comes of selling it. Leave me here, in peace, and we never need to speak of any of this again. Push me in court, and I promise you every document in this folder becomes public within a week. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of an old clock ticking on the mantel. Preston, Corinne, and Theo looked at each other, then at Adelaide. Seeing her, she realized for the first time in 30 years, not as a house guest, not as help, but as a woman holding every card and entirely willing to play them. We'll discuss it, Preston said finally, his voice tighter than before. Take your time, Adelaide said, but understand something before you go. This place was always mine. Your father loved you in his own way, I believe that. But he loved me enough to protect me, even when he wasn't brave enough to do it out loud. They left without another word. Adelaide stood on the porch and watched the SUV disappear down the dirt road. then went inside and sat in Julian's chair by the window. And for the first time since his death, she cried tears that felt like relief instead of grief. Preston dropped the legal challenge within the week. Nathaniel called to confirm it himself, some relief audible in his voice that Adelaide suspected had less to do with billing hours and more to do with genuinely liking her more than he'd ever been able to say out loud while Julian was alive. Ashcombe Manor went on the market not long after, and it sat there for the better part of 9 months before it finally sold, well under what Preston had originally quoted to anyone who'd listen. The mortgage Julian had quietly taken against it 2 years before his death ate into the proceeds more than any of them had planned for. The company shares came with restrictions Julian had built in years earlier, tied to performance reviews and continued active management, conditions that turned out to be a good deal more demanding than either Preston or Corinne had bothered to read closely before celebrating. Adelaide heard about most of it secondhand through Nathaniel and felt surprisingly little about any of it. Not triumph exactly, something quieter. The particular calm of a woman who no longer needed anything from people who'd never really given her much to begin with. She spent those same months turning Fernwood Hall from Julian's shrine into something that was finally, hers. She hired 2 men from town to help bring the gardens back, and by early spring the fountain ran clear again. The rose beds stood in tidy rows, the stone paths had been reset and cleared of 30 years of creeping grass. She kept the photographs Julian had hung, all of them, but she added her own choices alongside them now. Paintings she liked, books she actually wanted on the shelves instead of the ones that had simply always been there. She replaced some of the furniture. She kept his chair by the window because some things earned the right to stay exactly as they were. She started spending Tuesdays and Thursdays at the little library that Julian had once quietly saved, shelving returns, helping the younger patrons find what they needed. She joined the small congregation at the Stone Church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew each week, greeted by name by people who seemed genuinely glad to see her walk in. Ruth then became something like the sister Adelaide had never had growing up as an only child, the two of them trading stories over tea most evenings, comfortable in a way that 30 years at Ashcombe had never once managed to produce. For the first time since she was 38 years old, Adelaide had people in her life who wanted nothing from her at all except her company. One afternoon in early spring, going through the last of the filing cabinets in Julian's study, she found a second envelope, smaller than the first, tucked behind a drawer divider, marked simply for later, when you're ready. Inside was a deed to another parcel, 18 acres at the edge of town, with a small barn already standing on it, along with documentation for a trust fund for $100,000 set aside for whatever Adelaide chose to build with it. A short note in his handwriting read, "This one's a blank page. Whatever you want it to be, make it. You spent 30 years living inside my life. This part is only yours." Adelaide sat with that note for a long time before she knew what she wanted to do with it. Eventually the answer came to her while she was talking with Ruth and about a woman 2 towns over, a widow in her 70s who'd been left with almost nothing after 40 years of marriage and had nowhere steady to land. Adelaide thought about her own first weeks in Thistlewood Hollow, arriving with 3 suitcases and no idea what came next, and how much it had mattered that Ruth showed up with a basket of bread before Adelaide had even asked for help. She decided to build a retreat on that 18 acres, a place for women exactly like her, women who'd spent decades disappearing into someone else's life and needed somewhere quiet to figure out who they still were underneath it. She called it the Winslow House, using her own maiden name for the first time in 30 years on anything that mattered, and broke ground that summer with Ruth standing beside her at the edge of the barn, already drawing up plans for a garden. By autumn, as the oaks around Fernwood Hall turned the color of old copper, Adelaide sat on her porch some evenings and thought about the whole strange shape of what had happened to her. The humiliation of the will reading. The particular cruelty of 30 days spent being slowly erased from a house she'd run for 3 decades. And then the drive west, the stone house nobody in the family thought was worth the trip, and everything it turned out to be holding. Julian had been flawed in ways she understood better now than she ever had while he was alive. Too quiet when he should have spoken, too willing to let peace in his own house cost her a place on the wall. But he had also spent 30 years building her something durable and secret, patient in a way she hadn't recognized as love until she was standing inside it. He'd given her freedom disguised as an afterthought. He'd given her power disguised as a consolation prize. And somewhere in that locked cedar chest, in that quiet stone house, he'd trusted that she was strong enough to find her way there and understand exactly what it meant once she did. Adelaide Vance was 68 years old, and for 30 years she had been whoever everyone else in that house needed her to be. Here, in a place that had waited 3 decades just for her, she was finally free to find out who she actually was underneath all of it. And she was beginning to suspect that at 68, she was only just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.